On to our third of the World Affairs Councils of America's, or of New Hampshire's, sorry, on foreign policy candidate campaign events. We're here with Vikram Mansharamani, Republican candidate for the U.S. Senate race in the primary coming up on September 13th. And we're really excited to have you. Thank you, Vikram, for joining us today.
Great, Tim. Thanks for having me.
I have a few bits of housekeeping to get to before we get started. So the World Affairs Council of New Hampshire is a nonprofit, nonpartisan membership organization, which means that we do not take stances on policy, politics, issues, or candidates themselves. This series is an opportunity for the voters of New Hampshire to hear from the candidates themselves on their own ideas as to the U.S.'s role in the world. It is a great opportunity to really explore some of these opportunities, some of these key issues that the world is facing today, and to become better informed citizens so that you can make the best decision at the polls that is for you. So we hope that you do listen to all of our campaign events and that you have the opportunity to get out there and vote on the 13th. As I mentioned, the World Affairs Council of New Hampshire is also a membership organization supported by the community, and we want to thank everyone who helps to make this program and others like it possible here in the state. I'll turn it over to Vikram here in a moment, but I just want to give a little bit of his background. Vikram is an author, he is a business leader, a thought leader. He was named to was it Worth and
Worth Magazine?
Worth Magazine and Financial Times top 100, not Financial Times.
Okay.
Top.
It was the Worth Magazine listed me as the top 100 most powerful person in global finance.
Correct. Okay, there we go.
Something like that.
A bit of a mouthful, but we got there. He also interned for Ambassador Lilly and worked at the American Enterprise Institute back in the day. If you want to go back and listen to our February and March Global in the Granite State podcasts, we had a couple of conversations with Vikram about his insights into the Uyghurs in China, their treatment by the Chinese central government, as well as discussion on the Olympics and the diplomatic boycott that the U.S. and some of its partners had back then. And then we also had Vikram speak on our global tipping points earlier this year. I believe that was back in March.
That's right.
To talk about global supply chain. So
Yep.
we've done a lot with you before your candidacy,
That's right.
and now we're having you back. So
Yeah.
thank you so much for your time.
Well, thanks, Tim, for having me. I mean, I think it is interesting because all those issues are still as relevant today as they were months and months ago, right? The Chinese regime still remains one of the biggest threats to the American way of life on this planet. The Chinese regime is still brutally attacking its own people in Western China. And, supply chains are still broken, right? We still got to fix those. And by the way, China's involved in that story too.
Right.
So, yeah, look, I'm looking forward to our conversation because actually the world is as interesting as it's ever been. It's filled with all sorts of problems, and it's never been more important to have strong American leadership. So.
We've keyed up a couple of good topics there for us to dive right into, but speaking of American leadership, first and foremost, can you just give us and your audience here a little bit of a insight into what you think U.S. global leadership should look like, can look like,
Sure.
and where we go from here?
Sure. Well, I am not an isolationist. Let's be very clear. I believe America should have a leadership role in the world. We have a set of values that I don't apologize for, and they accommodate individual rights and freedoms and liberties, and I think that's really important. I think we should learn to respect others, and we should insist that others respect others. What that means is that American leadership is a force for good in the world, and I really believe that. Now, that also means that when we telegraph strength, our enemies will take notice. And when we telegraph weakness, our enemies take advantage. And so I'm a big believer that a strong U.S. military, a strong leadership role of the U.S. in the world leads to a safer, more peaceful, and prosperous planet.
So to dive a little bit deeper into that, it seems like you put military strength first. Is that an accurate reading?
No, I think it's part of the mix, right?
Sure.
I really think we're in a world where increasingly great power rivalry is what's defining the geopolitics. And as such, it is economic might, it is military might, it is social or soft power might, it is technology capability, it is space capability, it is all of the above. And as such, I think you could describe very simply American strength at home, which is a prosperous middle class, a strong economy, etc., leads to American strength abroad, which leads to a better world.
Mm-hmm. Great. And what would you say the U.S. Can best offer the world in terms of global leadership?
Well, I think one of the things is just demonstrating our values and making sure others understand there are certain expectations in the world. We don't want an expansionistic China. We don't want an expansionistic, Russia. We don't want countries trying to change the world in ways that are driven by force and brute strength on imposing on others. And so I think that's one place to start. I mean, there's a lot of places to start. We can talk about sort of sovereignty in space. You can talk about cyber. We can talk, there's a lot of ways we can go. I'll let you choose where we go.
Yeah, we'll definitely get into a lot of those topics. But one more thing on U.S. global leadership. Can you tell us what you view as some of the recent successes that the U.S. has had and some of the recent issues or failures that the U.S. has had?
Yeah, well, unfortunately, it's been a lack of American leadership that's led us to the geopolitical world that I think we're in today. And in that regard, I think we have to look at what's happened over the last, let's call it 10, 12 years, 10 years or so, with what happened in Crimea, leading to Russia getting slapped on its wrist, but nothing effectively happening. Leading to looking at what happened in the South China Sea, where, Xi Jinping sat there and told President Obama, we will not militarize these islands. And he militarized those islands. And, the international community said that's not allowed. No one decided to enforce it. American weakness on full display. And then followed up by the disastrous withdrawal from Afghanistan, leading to our enemies, instead of taking notice of American strength, looking and saying, wait, hold on, American weakness is what we see. Even our allies, Great Britain, I understand they learned about the withdrawal from Afghanistan by watching CNN. This is an ally that has stood shoulder to shoulder with us, sharing as a percentage of their population in terms of casualties, sharing as a percentage of their economic, of their GDP as a percentage of their military deployments or dollars spent. Since 1917, they've been side by side with us. And they found out about our withdrawal from Afghanistan via CNN. Of course, this kind of weakness is noticed and taken advantage of. And so Russia and Putin saw this world. This is the world they saw. And so, not surprisingly, we had some more, activity in that part of the world with Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And so that, I think, is a direct result of American weakness. Further, and my guess is you'll want to talk more about this, but it wouldn't surprise me to see Chinese activity across the Taiwan Strait, right? That, again, this is the world of American weakness being telegraphed, and the world feeling like, oh, America's not on they're not on their game.
Yeah.
So that's a little bit on the weakness.
Yeah. Okay. Any strengths that you've seen or positive developments?
In the last couple of years, I would say no. I'm not trying to make it explicitly for a particular time frame, but look, let's be honest. The prior administration had us, at least in things like energy independence, which led to less geopolitical tensions. We had a different world in the prior administration. The Democrats have proven weakness, in particular Biden's weakness. And look, his own team, Biden's own team, Gates, who I think was Secretary of Defense during Obama, has referred to President Biden's been on the wrong side of every foreign affairs decision for 40 some odd years. And that's his own team saying that. The climate change agenda, I was going to say, we were going back in the right direction, but I would tell you we were going in the wrong direction, I think. And this may be quite controversial for some of the listeners here, but I believe, canceling the Keystone Pipeline and rejoining the Paris Climate Accords and turning around and making carbon such an evil development or sort of evil thing has led to a less safe world. Mm-hmm. It really has, because it gives power to those with resources rather than, honestly, and by the way, it would also be for the benefit of the environment. If America pumped oil and gas, we have better environmental regulations here. We have better restrictions. When we get methane flaring from a drilling well, we don't just let it go into the environment. We don't just pour drilling fluids into the ground. America is better with its environmental regulations around oil and gas than any Kazakhstan drilling regulation or Indonesian drilling regulation would be. And so if we don't pump, it's coming from somewhere, and if it's coming from somewhere, it's probably hurting the environment. Further, the Chinese and Indians are building coal-fired power plants like they're going out of style. And so it's fine for us to beat up carbon, but it's one planet, Tim. It really is. This is one environment. The carbon's going everywhere. And so at the end of the day, I think we're creating a less safe world because of the geopolitics of energy, but it's not clear we're helping the environment either. Yeah. And this sort of next wave of this, which is going to create more complications and more vulnerabilities and bigger problems, is the same thing if you look at the analysis of the value chain and the supply chain for electrification, right? Electric vehicles don't produce energy. They don't. We can think that all we want. Electric vehicles don't produce energy. They are storage vehicles. They're storage devices for energy. If you really, depending upon where you live in the country, or where you live in the state even, you could actually be driving a coal-fired vehicle. Let's call it what it is. If the electricity's coming from coal, you're driving a coal-fired powered vehicle. That's what you're doing. And that's not necessarily better than gasoline. And so for lots of reasons, and I'll bring it back to the global affairs side, I think the climate change logic of, hey, we're going to cooperate and coordinate, which everyone was thinking was possible, is not possible. It's not possible because at the end of the day, there's a trade-off between costs and benefits. America today, with the climate change agenda, has decided that it will take the certain costs of higher energy and the uncertain benefits that may accrue to the environment. China and India have opted for the certain benefits of cheap, reliable energy and the uncertain costs on the environment. It's not clear which is better, but I can tell you where I'd fall. I would choose the certain benefits and the uncertain costs. I'm also a big believer, Tim, and I realize I'm taking us down the climate change path, but
we can go wherever you like.
We'll come back. I'm a big believer in technological innovation and American ingenuity. Look, at the end of the day, the American capitalist system is the most innovative. We have the best innovation capacity because of the venture capital, basic science, research, technology at universities. We are among the best. And so I think we'll move beyond fossil fuels, not because we beat them up, because we'll actually develop the next energy. Whether that's fusion or something else, we will do that. I believe we can. It's funny. I was talking to a group of elementary students. They said, we didn't move beyond the Stone Age because we said stones were bad. We moved beyond because we got to the Bronze Age. We developed the technology. That's the solution forward. Coming up with the next thing, not taking these certain costs and uncertain benefits while others are taking certain benefits and uncertain costs.
Sure. So I'm really interested to dive into your comments about making the world being less safe geostrategically because of beating up on carbon.
Yes.
You look around the world, and who are the people who are producing the most oil and gas? Russia, Saudi Arabia, Venezuela. People who do not necessarily support our traditional American values.
That's right.
So doesn't it make us, and my wife hates when I play devil's advocate because I do it too well, but doesn't it actually hurt us and make things less geostrategically safe if we are so dependent and reliant on the Russias, Saudi Arabias, Venezuelas for
that's exactly my point. We have given up energy independence, which is hurting us economically and making the world less safe. That's a double whammy of negativity, right? Why? It's the same thing. We shouldn't be dependent on our enemies. We went from exporting oil and gas to our friends and allies. That's good for the world. That's good for American interests in the world. To a world where we are now importing from those who hate us. And by the way, Biden changing it from import, oh, we don't like Russia, they've invaded Ukraine, therefore we're not going to take oil and gas from them. So we're going to go to Saudi Arabia? They have a wonderful human rights record. To Venezuela, not exactly an American ally of any stretch. Iran, you're going to go cut a deal to give billions to terrorists to sort of get oil to lower inflation so you can get a midterm win? Like, these are crazy ideas, especially given we have plenty of oil and gas, not only oil and gas, all energy here in the here in the United States. But we should have an all of the above energy policy. We really should. Coal, fine. Oil and gas, yes. Solar, if it makes sense. I don't believe in solar or wind that's inefficient. I don't believe we should be subsidizing. Tax you so I can put inefficient solar on my roof. That doesn't make sense to me. I'm okay with solar making sense for you because you live in Florida. You live in the Nevada deserts. Good for you. You live in a windy spot. Have wind. Great. I don't want to be subsidizing inefficiency. Let's grow the pie of economic resources and we'll be able to adapt to whatever the environment throws at us.
Cool. So getting back to sort of where we were originally hoping to take this.
Sorry,
no, that's okay. It's good to have these conversations and be able to have the back and forth, I think. So, of course, one of the biggest geopolitical challenges of the day is the U.S.-China relationship. We have seen ups and downs in that relationship, but mainly downs over the past 5 to 10 years. We had the pivot to Asia under the Obama administration. We had the trade war and the rise of the pandemic during the Trump administration. Yeah. So with tensions running so high these days between these two countries, what do you view as the future of the relationship between the U.S. and China?
Yeah, so it's negative. I'll answer the question bluntly. It's a negative outlook right now for the U.S.-China relationship, but let's understand how we got here. And this comes back to a fundamental sort of miscalculation on the part of America and the West. We believed that including China in the world economy would ultimately lead to them getting richer, more prosperous, and that economic prosperity would lead to political reform. It would make them democratic. Make them rich, they'll turn democratic. They'll protect individual rights, freedoms, they'll care about the system, they'll want to protect it. And in fact, that assessment over the last 30, 40 years has proven wrong. We, in fact, enabled the rise of the Chinese Communist Party's authoritarian instinct. We've given them the strength to do so. We've helped them with economic resources. We've enabled their military to grow. We've enabled all of Chinese. This has been something we allowed to happen, and not only allowed, we assisted with happening. So we've gotten to this spot from a fundamental miscalculation, and it goes back, actually. It's interesting that you noted in your intro, Tim, that I worked for Ambassador Jim Lilly. He was the U.S. ambassador to China during Tiananmen Square. And that was a formative event in my life. I remember watching that and saying, how is it possible that we have such an evil regime, that they are attacking their own people? And, you know, I was 15, 16 years old, and I was like, this is just weird. This is evil. Like, this is literally evil. They're killing their own people. They're attacking their own people. And so I went and I spent years working with Jim Lilly, a great man. He's passed away, but Jim Lilly was an absolutely thoughtful individual on understanding China, their long-term strategy, the role of deception, and their plans and how they think in different time horizons. And it's funny, back at AEI in the 90s, we were looking at Chinese military modernization, China's surge south, pushing out past the island chain, the South China Sea territorial disputes and how China would militarize them over long periods of time. All of these issues were shockingly relevant back then, visible that they were coming, and they've come now today. Today, it is not a trade war. It is not a currency war. It is all of the above, and it's an arms race. It's a space race. It is a race of values. This is great power rivalry. That is what this is, Tim. This is a, I would say Cold War, but it feels like it's warming up, if you will, right? I think this is going to lead to a fundamental reorientation of the global economy. We're going to have a splitting of the world economy into two ecosystems, like I talked about in our supply chain talk, in March. You're going to have two ecosystems, one led by the Chinese and one led by the Americans. And that framing of the ecosystem world it's not an anti-globalization story.
Sure.
The world will stay global, but you will line up with countries that have similar values and approaches to thinking about the future. It's going to be things like, China cares about the community, not the individual. We care about individuals. Simple philosophical differences will be the basis upon this reorientation. But make no mistake, that rivalry is going to be painful in terms of what it takes for supply chains to disentangle. I don't think America should be dependent on China for pharmaceutical ingredients, rare earths, electronics. There's a long list of things for which we are dependent upon Chinese production for. We got to stop that. We got to bring those capabilities back home. Likewise, the Chinese are dependent on us for things, and they are likewise figuring out how to get off of the U.S. dependence, right? They don't want to have to be dependent upon America for agriculture. Basic ingredients for their social stability, their people, they got to feed them, right? And so they're going to Africa, they're going west, not east, to find food sources at some level. So yeah, I think it's a complicated relationship. I don't see an easy path towards improvement. And my thoughts about climate change and thinking about climate change, because ultimately, oftentimes, if I get pushed back by geopolitical leaders and others around the planet, they say, listen, well, at least the US and China can cooperate on the climate, right? No. Actually, no. I don't think we, definitely not here in the Grand State, want to be putting up solar panels on our roof made by forced labor, by slave labor, from Uyghur concentration camps. No, I don't think so. I don't think we want to necessarily be dependent upon them for the rare earth magnets, which are so critical for electric vehicles and electrification, wind turbines, etc. And so, actually, that's going to be a basis of competition. So, climate competition, not cooperation, is where I see that going as well.
So, the theory of bringing China and Russia, post-Soviet Russia, into the geopolitical economy and really trying to integrate them was not only about helping those countries to grow and engage and hopefully become more democratic, which has not worked in either case to this point, but it was also about preventing major wars. We haven't seen a major war between great powers.
That's the key part, between great powers.
We have, yes, of course, we've seen wars. We're seeing a war going on right now with Russia and Ukraine. But the question I have is that in this predicted decoupling that you're seeing coming, does that make the world less safe? Are we going to go back to a world in which we see more wars going on between states rather than within states?
Well, what we've seen, let's look back at yes, during the Cold War we had skirmishes on the edge, right? You sort of had Vietnam going, and I'm not suggesting that's a small war, that was a big war. You had Afghanistan, and that went on for a long time, and was going on again for a long time. So I don't see the world changing materially in that regard. Literally, World War, two great powers against each other. World War II was really the last time where that existed in a direct sense. There's been proxy sort of battles, indirect conflicts on the edges, but I don't see that happening. I think we've gotten technologically advanced enough. We've seen different capacities in cyber and space and different technological dependence, which becomes both a vulnerability and an offensive capability as well, that I think that the definition of war is changing. Look, depending on what you think about the origins of the virus, you might argue that was a war. Depending upon what you think in terms of what's happening in cybersecurity, you might think that there's been cyber wars. Depending upon what you think of what's happening in currency markets and what's transpired with the pushing of inflation to different places, you might say there's been currency wars. The definition of war is getting to be changed, and that's amorphous with this multi-factor global rivalry. So I don't know how to answer the question, is there going to be more war or less war? If you define war in all domains, there's definitely been more war. There's been a structural rise in competition between the US and China, and there's more fronts to have wars.
Okay. One of the key areas that may lead to a kinetic war, we'll call it, is the Taiwan issue. We've seen since the Nancy Pelosi visit and the subsequent congressional delegation visiting Taiwan, massive military drills by the Chinese government surrounding the island of Taiwan. So what do you think, based on your opinion, is the U.S.'s responsibility within this conflict?
Look, this Taiwan issue is a big deal. It's a big deal for a couple reasons, and it matters to all of us here in this country for a lot of reasons. But let's start with one very obvious, very direct, and very, it sounds trivial, but just economic issue. 92% of the world's most advanced semiconductors are made in Taiwan. The other 8% are made in Korea. So these are the most advanced, capable semiconductors that power our defense applications, as well as a lot of our high-end applications in America. So that concerns me, just very bluntly on that front. We're trying to build semiconductor production capacity here in the United States. That process is underway. We're getting there. We're making progress. But we don't have the talent. There's bottlenecks. These things don't happen. Tim, you don't just snap your fingers and say, hey, semiconductor plant, let's put one up there tomorrow. It takes a year, 2 years, 3 years. The equipment, by the way, is also got supply chain bottlenecks. And then you got talent bottlenecks. So this is a tough situation, and we have vulnerability. So let's admit we have that vulnerability. Number two, this is a democracy. This is a democracy that represents the American value system in Southeast Asia. We want to preserve and protect that. We don't want to let that fall and just be taken over in this expansionistic way. And I understand my friends from China and others I've met over the years continue to persist that there's one China based in Beijing and blah, blah, blah. And yeah, I get it. And they continue to, which is why I think the strategic ambiguity logic has kept them on edge. And I think that we need to do everything in our power to deter Chinese aggression across the Taiwan Strait. And that means, maintaining navigation through that strait. We shouldn't have any qualms about doing that. I don't think we should be firing shots at the Chinese Navy either. I'm not encouraging a hot war where we attack them, but international waters, we're happy to traffic as we have done traditionally. And I think that's probably the way we should focus on is deterrence. Make sure that we have our friends and allies in the region understand this is the game plan. They too are working on deterrence. Figure out where China has vulnerabilities and make sure that they understand these vulnerabilities are stuff we are aware of. Make it a multi-factor, full spectrum, pressure.
And so you would be supportive of continuing strategic ambiguity?
Well, I think the strategic ambiguity was healthy for a while. I am comfortable with strategic ambiguity with the understanding we want to deter. Mm-hmm. And insofar as strategic ambiguity encourages or leaves the door open, so it's hard to because it comes in the context of American weakness. Right now, do I want strategic ambiguity? No, I want strategic strength globally, American leadership, which we don't have. Look, if we had a different president, maybe we'd have American strength and it would be a different dynamic. And then strategic ambiguity would be okay. I'm comfortable with strategic ambiguity as long as that deterrence is there. When you don't create the deterrence factor and you claim ambiguity, then it's sort of, hey, maybe you want to come take Taiwan, maybe you don't, I don't know, whatever you want. We might come and attack you. We're not telling you. We're going to defend. I like that. Walk softly, carry a really big stick.
Well, that's a perfect point that none of this is easy. Yeah. None of this has a simple answer. It's all very complex, which is why we need to have these conversations and dive deep. So switching over to, as we mentioned, the war in Ukraine. NATO has been a big part of that while trying to stay out of it in terms of that kinetic war. But they have been supplying Ukraine. They have been working towards a resolution, hopefully sooner rather than later, but we'll have to wait and see what happens there. Can you give a little bit of your insights into NATO's initial response over the first 6 months to this invasion?
It's interesting because, as you know, Ukraine's not a NATO member, right? So right off the bat, the question asking the NATO response, it should have been a global response, and I think we've seen a lot of global response. We want to prevent aggression and mass atrocities, and we should have the compassion and the humanitarian instinct to prevent the innocent killing of humans, civilians, and that's not okay. It feels barbaric that it's just allowed to take place in today's 21st century. It just seems wrong on so many fronts. Again, inspired by American weakness internationally. What should we be doing, or what have we done? We should enable the Ukrainians to defend themselves. We should give them whatever they need. Now, I'm not for blank checks and writing in handouts galore, because ultimately American dollars going and American equipment going abroad to individual places without oversight, without transparency, and without accountability concerns me. Right? I just recently heard, and I haven't not actually been able to validate it, that the Ukrainian parliament gave themselves like a 70% pay raise on the back of US dollars flowing in. Now, again, I'll have to validate that, but I literally heard that the other day. I was like, if that's true, and maybe it's not, it's offensive that our support gets deployed in certain ways. We want to help them help themselves. I don't want to be in a hot war. I don't want American forces actually interacting directly with Russian forces and risking great power, hot conflict, kinetic conflict. Now, your question was about NATO, so let's take that question a little bit. What if Russia kept going? What if they went into a NATO country? Well, then it is crystal clear, based on Article 5, we will be at war. America and our NATO allies are at war with Russia. And we need to acknowledge that that's what we have. We have obligations in that responsibilities as a country, and we should absolutely withhold them. Not withhold, excuse me. We should stand behind them. We should stand behind them. We should absolutely respect our obligations and commitments, and that means American forces. And that's okay. That has to happen. There is a red line. And by the way, the more we telegraph that red line and tell Putin this is a red line, the less likely it is we'll end up in a war.
So we actually hosted, through one of our international visitor programs last year, 3 Ukrainian members of parliament, and one of them was here 2 weeks ago. So we'll check in with them and see their response to that. But of course, NATO has been trying to prevent a expansion of this war. They do not want it to come to NATO. There's not very much. There's not a lot of interest in the U.S. in starting another quote-unquote forever war. So what can we do to, beyond the red lines and telegraphing what those red lines are, what can we do to help ensure that this does not expand? Do we need to, a lot of people have been saying, we need to, just let Russia have what they want, and then we move on and we can be done with the war. Other people are saying we need to support the Ukrainians full force and help push Russia back out and even beyond where beyond Crimea and the Donbass region.
Sure.
What are your hopes for the end goal of this war?
The Russia-Ukraine war, rather than NATO. Sorry, I was confused. But Russia-Ukraine, I think, look, what we want is to stop the violence, stop the humanitarian problems that are occurring there, and let Russia know it's not okay. That is something for the Ukrainian people to decide how and where, whether it's pushed back or just say, hey, that part's de facto Russia anyway. I don't know. I don't believe in allowing or giving little pieces and sort of appeasing, if you will, because the appeasement strategy for, dictator aggressors like Putin usually encourages more such behavior. So I'm not a fan of that. I don't know how it ends him. I don't. I think the Russians are probably shocked that they're finding themselves in this situation. I think they're realizing their own military capacities were less than they themselves thought. And so I think there's sort of disappointment all around. I don't know what the off-ramp is, but I hope that folks who are smarter than me figure one out.
Yeah. Well, that'll be the million or maybe even $billion question to answer.
Multi-billion, yeah.
So NATO, of course, has been in the news over the past 5 or 6 years, as President Trump, when he was in office, questioned the value of that relationship. Mm-hmm. We have seen the U.S. Ratify the treaty to bring Finland and Sweden into the alliance, still working through the other countries, of course, but can you talk a little bit about what you view as the value or less than value for NATO?
Yeah. Look, America should always view its engagement in treaties on a cost-benefit analysis. And we should do that with everything. I mean, that makes eminent sense. Every country's doing that. We should be doing it too. So the cost is we're paying our share of the NATO budget, which is fine if everybody else pays their share, and they haven't been. And so we shouldn't be taking disproportionate burden because we're not getting disproportionate benefit. We should be taking our share of the burden, and I think that's eminently appropriate. So in terms of expanding it, in terms of that, if people come in and pay their share, they continue to contribute, and it is in fact a mutual treaty that involves everyone contributing and getting similar benefits, then it's fine to maintain. It is a treaty, it is an obligation, we should stand behind it and respect it.
So if countries continue to not meet their fair share, what are some of the steps that you think the U.S. should take?
We should offer to let them out of the treaty. You don't have the ability to stay in it. You don't have the ability to pay your obligations. I'm sorry. You know what, Tim? You don't pay your mortgage, you don't pay your car payments. If I don't pay my mortgage or car payments, they're going to help me get out of that obligation one way or the other.
And so you are looking at it very much at the economic input.
Not just. That was the sort of the we were talking about the cost side. The benefit side is, look, we don't want an expansionistic Russia. Mm-hmm. Period. We don't want it. Europe obviously doesn't want it. And so there is this mutual desire, and the benefit is telegraphing strength, right? If we had stronger strength in the White House, maybe we wouldn't have to telegraph it so much through treaties and sort of teamwork, but we do need this strength. And so think of the calculus it gives someone like Putin. Going to Ukraine, we'll get some pushback. Going towards Finland, hold on. Full force of not just, America, but all the European NATO allies are suddenly we're at war with all. It is changing the calculus on their side as well, right? Which is one attack met by attack of lots of countries. That should deter. It should deter. A rational actor should say, wait, that doesn't make sense. Let's not do this. And in fact, it seems to have actually worked. So I'm in favor of that, deterrence in that regard.
Yeah. Of course, no conversation about the war in Russia war in Ukraine via Russia can be complete without talking about the nuclear threat.
Yep.
Not only nuclear weapons, but the nuclear power plants that the Russians are occupying and both sides are accusing each other of shooting at, which is not anything anyone wants to see. Putin has a number of times threatened to use nuclear weapons, whether they're tactical or full scale. What can we do about this?
Yeah, that's got to be a red line. That's just got to be a red line. That's not an okay use. Again, we're living in the 21st century where you would think none of this could be happening, and yet enabled by one individual sitting in Moscow who's been isolated through COVID and thinking about the world differently is not a recipe for stability. And so let's encourage the calculus to be made appropriately in Moscow. Let's make that crystal clear. And so I believe the use of, in fact, I would argue any of these weapons of mass destruction should be off limits and should be seen as a red line that, if crossed, would be met by a devastating response.
Okay, well, this was an unplanned question, but I think fits well.
Yeah.
You say the use of weapons of mass destruction should be a red line. Does that include first use by the U.S.?
Yeah, I don't think the U.S. should be saying that we're going to go use nuclear weapons anywhere in the world until we're attacked. Yeah, absolutely. I'm not a fan of starting wars with nuclear weapons. I'm not a fan of, and now look, at the end of the day, if we had to end a war that was started on us, look, you can think through all sorts of doomsday scenarios, but if someone attacked the United States using a nuclear weapon, would I be opposed to using a nuclear weapon? Absolutely not. Right. We will be using the full force of the United States to make sure that risk is eliminated instantaneously. So I am all about that. Sure. But I don't think we should be utilizing nuclear weapons first.
Yeah. Okay. So moving away a bit from war, finally,
yes,
half an hour into the conversation, but that I think shows the importance of it, of where we are and where the world is. Inflation. We're seeing it all across the world. I think Turkey is experiencing 90% plus inflation. Venezuela has, for many reasons outside of the the war in Ukraine, seen massive amounts of inflation. And of course, we've seen inflation here in the U.S. as well. Can you talk a little bit about what you see as the drivers of this global inflation and what we can do as the U.S. to help control it? Because we are a global market, and this is something that's affecting everyone.
Yes, it does affect everyone, but let's talk first about the United States, then we'll talk about its world impact. Yeah. Within the United States, we had out-of-control spending in D.C., deficit spending using borrowed dollars, right? So that's not a good recipe when you have supply chain shortages. So you give people a lot of money, you print a lot of money, you hand out a lot of money, whatever it is, and for whatever reason, the goods don't expand at the same rate, or the services don't expand at the same rate, you get a mismatch. And so what do you get? You get inflation. And by the way, there are lots of reasons that could generate inflation that weren't self-imposed, but in this regard, we know a meaningful percentage of this inflation was generated through policy. Just simple policy, handing money out, spending money. In fact, just a couple weekends ago, we had this, $740 billion bill called the Inflation Reduction Act. When you are spending, how can you call that inflation reduction? It doesn't work. And by the way, we're not, I won't go back there, I promise. But a large portion of that was electric vehicles and stuff saying, hey, we're going to biggest climate change reduce. No, we're misguided on that. We're misguided on the labeling. It reminds me of the Affordable Care Act. I don't know anyone who has care that's affordable anymore, right? I mean, there's just the names are even wrong. So we got to contain inflation here in a couple ways. One, we got to stop the out-of-control spending. Number two, we should get an energy policy that works, right? Again, I won't go back to that whole conversation, but energy policy has driven inflation. I think Tim, I'm on the board of an Omaha company, actually, since you're from Omaha, Werner Enterprises, and one of the largest trucking companies in America, and I can tell you that higher diesel prices lead to higher freight rates, which means higher prices for everything that's been moved by truck. So energy bleeds into everything. The inflation gets stickier, and then you get the risk of these wage price spirals, which is prices go up. Tim, you go ahead and you call your boss and you say, hey, listen, I can't pay my bills. You gotta pay me more, I can't do the job. They pay you more, but what do? You go out and you then buy those goods that went up in price, thereby creating the higher price goods. And then you come back and say, well, I did, but prices kept going up. You gotta give me another raise. And you're seeing that process just starting to get stickier. Wages are going up, not as much as inflation, but they are going up. And if you start getting inflation sticky, wages sticky, you start getting a wage price spiral. That's a recipe that keeps central bankers up at night. We need to be really careful about that. So that's the American inflation story. By the way, I think to globalize it, the supply chains being disrupted because of the pandemic, and for other reasons, honestly. That's inflationary, right? I mean, there's sort of two ways you get prices go up. You got a supply and demand. Supply goes down, demand goes up. That makes inflation. Or you could just keep supply constant, give them more to spend on, more demand, same supply, prices go up. Or demand stays the same, but supply goes down, prices go up, right? So we know the sort of mechanisms here. And so supply chains being disrupted, being dependent on China, the lockdowns from COVID, obviously the Russia-Ukraine conflict has created supply chain disruption in other areas such as fertilizers and other commodities. There's been supply chain disruptions as well. Now, why is the whole world experiencing this? Why is there global inflation of this order of magnitude? And that comes down to central bank policies around the world were very stimulating because of COVID. So the label was lowered rates, printed money, etc. Coming out of COVID, maybe we're out, and nobody's really taking it back. And so you print a lot when there's no demand, and then you don't take it back, and now the demands come back, and so what do? You get inflation. You have not produced the goods and services, i.e. there's been no supply side response, you're just seeing demand response, and so you get out of whack. And that's what's happened. By the way, that's not getting into the dynamics of importing and exporting inflation via currency movements, but I don't want to get too econo-speaky on you.
Yeah, well, that's helpful because I'm not an economist, despite my college years where I thought I might be.
It's interesting. I don't think of myself as an economist. A lot of people label me one, but I'm not. I think of myself as a multifaceted global generalist. I don't think of myself as as an economist, because I don't live in silos. I think the insights are from across silos.
Yeah, great. So can you also talk a little bit about your view of the pressures that the sanctions on Russia have impacted inflation, and whether or not to you and to your potential constituents, do you think those sanctions are important despite inflation to keep the pressure on Russia?
Well, it depends what the goal of the sanctions were. So if the goal was to starve Russia of money, it just hasn't worked. Russia has more capital flowing into Moscow today because of higher energy prices, fine, a little bit less volume, but much higher prices. They're fine. Like it has not impacted. Yes, they can't maybe take some money got seized here, some assets got seized there. Yes, they feel maybe a little limited in the global financial system. But what did India do? India stepped up and said, you know what, we need oil. We're going to power our economy. Russia, you got oil. The U.S. doesn't want to take it. They've cut you off from the dollar system. I tell you what, we'll pay in rubles. It's not working. It didn't work. Germany, what's happening to Germany right now? Germany has all sorts of rolling energy brownouts and they've got their sanctioned heat temperatures are going to be limited certain times of year. Landlords are saying only certain degrees are allowed. Certain hours of the day you'll have hot water. I mean, this is the impact that we've had by sanctioning Russia. And you think the Germans now, because of their climate change agenda, by the way, they went really hard towards solar in an inefficient solar environment, turned around, grew their dependence on Russia, and that's the world we're in. So how are you going to get compliance with all these sanctions given this very raw dependence that certain countries have on the need for energy that Russia has? So I don't think the sanctions have worked. I think they've increased costs on large portions of the world. They did create inflation. They've created a lot of benefits for Moscow. They've rewritten the world in ways that I'm not sure are better.
Sure. Okay. So one of the things that our organization is going to take a look at this fall is the future of trade. A lot has been made about free trade agreements. You had TPP fall through. You had the rewriting of NAFTA into the whatever USMCA. Can you talk a little bit about your view of trade?
Yep.
Of course, supply chains playing into that, but where do you see the future of trade, and is it free or is it fair?
Yeah, look, I think what's happening with trade is, if you remember my worldview of the world bifurcating into two global economies, we're going to see, I think, a lot more free trade within those ecosystems. So, U.S., Australia. That's a very obvious, easy ally to talk about. They got lots of commodities. We need commodities. They're a friendly country. We share. It's not just an economic relationship. It is a military relationship. It is an intelligence relationship. It is, a social values-based relationship. It is a media and culture-based relationship. It is a full spectrum relationship. There's going to be a lot of free trade there, right? That is not going to be seen. Yes, it's far away, etc., but it will de facto be seen as part of the American system. Let's go to the U.S.-China relationship. I think that trade numbers go down. It's very simple. Trade numbers go down. Definitely in volume. I don't know what happens with dollars because we'll see higher prices for things that need to cross these ecosystems. So while supply and demand may result in a certain price for something like corn, I'm talking about Nebraska, what would it be based on supply and demand in the United States? Well, when that crosses the threshold of ecosystems, now we're just talking about strategic pricing. You can imagine a Chinese negotiator saying, oh, well, it's $4 corn. We'll buy a bunch. No, for you, it's going to be $10 corn. And they're not going to have a choice, because there's no other option, etc. So in these strategic areas, there will be, I don't know what you call that type of trade, strategic trade. It's sort of a new word. We haven't thought about it. And that dynamic will take place in ecosystem crossing trade. But I think the bigger and more interesting dynamic is how these ecosystems form. And what I see right now is China trying to take Southeast Asia and through the Belt and I guess we don't really talk about it, the Belt and Road Initiative, which was their westward expansion down towards the Middle East and Africa, and the U.S. becoming more regionalized. I think that's what's happening, and so it's not an anti-globalization story. It's more of a a different globalization. I was going to say regionalization, but it's not just regionalization. It's just a different globalization, one where you're working with allies and you realize that economics is part of a full spectrum relationship, and trade is one part of the economics. And so, trade's a small piece of it, but it's a bigger relationship. And I think about this. I did a lot of work in the Middle East, and countries there were always discombobulated and very uncomfortable by the idea of having to pick a side. Very uncomfortable. Friends in the Middle East have said, but we like to sell our oil to China and have your military protection. We love this. And I was like, you're going to have to choose. We don't want to choose. Okay, when you upgrade your telecom equipment, are you going to Huawei or not? It's a choice. It's a choice. You're going to go to Huawei or not? You go to Huawei, you made your choice. I didn't even say this at the time, but it's true. Another country invades another country and there's a UN General Assembly vote. Do you vote to sanction it, or do you sit silent because you want to sell them oil? We've seen what's happened. We've seen this exact scenario. So the world is bifurcating. I think trade's a smaller component of the economic relationship, and the economic relationship is now less important than it has been. It's more of a full spectrum relationship as we see this world bifurcating.
So immigration has been a big issue for particularly this race, but also for a long time. Can you give us your assessment of the state of the U.S.-Mexico border and what your views on immigration are?
Sure. I just went to the border here last month. I'll tell you about that, but before, you just reminded me, and I think it's a classic story and it's worth telling it. So the same individuals in the Middle East that talk about U.S. military protection selling to China will often go on and talk about how America is this awful country that's intervening in these countries, and who are they, arrogant policemen, blah, 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 go on, and they'll criticize America as being horrible. And then when the meeting's over, they always are like, hey, come here. I want to see if my kid can go to college in America. Or do you know how I could maybe look at economic citizenship? And they're always asking. So they're happy to grandstand, but at the end of the day, they too realize America is a shining city on a hill, and they want to come here because they realize our way of life and freedoms are better than any place else in the world. So let's start there. The other thing I want to tell you really quickly, I don't know if all the folks here know, but those who have followed me on the trail know, I'm the son of two working class immigrants that came to this country seeking a better life. And since we're at the World Affairs Council, and since we talk about geopolitical history, the origins of that story begin in the Indian partition. When India was divided into West Pakistan, India, and East Pakistan, and my parents were on the wrong side of the line. They were in what is today Pakistan, back then West Pakistan, and fled. And they fled to modern-day India, and then my father made his way to the United States, got the golden ticket to come to this promised land and seek a better life for himself and his children. And so I've lived that American dream. And so America needs to always embrace immigrants. We are a nation of immigrants, and there is no question about it that we are better for having immigrants here. In fact, I don't know anyone, either here or anywhere, online or elsewhere, in America that doesn't have an immigrant story going back far enough, right? This is a nation of immigrants. And so we need to embrace that, and we should always understand that is a source of strength. It brings hard work. It self-selects even. It's even better than just a source of strength. It self-selects on risk takers, hard workers, people with grit, people who want to actually have a better future. Like, it's the perfect model, and we should embrace it. So, with that said, there is no excuse whatsoever for illegal immigration. We should not have an open border. I'm a big believer that actually a tall wall would be fine. I believe in a tall wall, but I want a wide gate too. And that means a legal immigration process. We can't have a backlog where the legal immigration process takes 10 years and you can walk across the border and just get, off and disappear into society and start living in America illegally. Like, that's a broken system. I'll give you another example from right here in the Granite State. In Nashua, I was talking to an entrepreneur. He's from India, was here on an H-1B visa, still is actually on an H-1B visa. It's been extended, different permutations, but he's been here 15 years, wants to be a U.S. citizen, has started businesses, has actually hired, he started a business under a larger umbrella company, but he's hired dozens and dozens of people. He's paid taxes. He's never taken a handout from the U.S. government. He's a hardworking, contributing member of society. His children were born here an American citizen. He's not yet an American citizen. One of the people he hired was from a different country, I think in the Middle East. She's now a U.S. citizen after 3 years of waiting. Seems messed up. We need to fix the quota system. We need to be embracing and understanding that there are people who want to come here, work hard, and deserve to be here. And that's a good thing, especially today where we have labor problems and insufficient labor in all sectors. I mean, look, one of the reasons we can't build out our semiconductor plants quick enough is we don't have the skilled high-end STEM talent we need. Because the graduates from our leading universities that want to stay here get sent home. That's also wrong. Like, we gotta fix this. So, yes, secure the border, stop the illegal immigration. And by the way, it's not just illegal immigration. There are drugs such as fentanyl. They've caught a bunch of known terrorists. I mean, leads to the question, well, how many did they not catch, right? So, yes, secure border. That's absolutely what we need. Tall wall. But we shouldn't lose track of what made America great, which is this wide gate, this shining city on a hill, this optimistic place where anyone can rise through anything. You know, it doesn't matter what your father did. It doesn't matter what kind of resources you have. Hard work, opportunities for all.
Sure. Well, I appreciate you bringing up the backlog of immigration, because I feel that gets short shrift in these conversations as a driver of illegal immigration.
It's cost benefits, same way I think about NATO. It's the same. Look, Tim, I'm a business guy, not a politician. I don't think in the way some of these politicians do. Cost benefits, right? So, okay, if I was trying to come into this country illegally, go wait in a long line, maybe never be not allowed to leave, have to come in, not sure what your status is, come in, just get started and enjoy the benefits thereof. What? Craziness. So, you know, and there's some policies we can do. E-Verify is one, for instance, where, you know, maybe that would change the cost-benefit analysis of someone thinking about trying to come to America. How do you do it?
Yeah. So another driver of immigration to the U.S., both legal and illegal, is the crisis in the Northern Triangle. Those countries obviously seeing higher rates of gang violence, murder, low economic growth, etc.
Well, that's a key point right there.
Right.
The economic activity is what spurs some of this stuff. Right. So I was involved in a U.S. Chamber of Commerce committee to help look at what was fueling some of the violence on the Afghan-Pakistan border. This was back in 2006 and 7. And it was through the U.S.-Pakistan Business Council. I was a member of that board of directors. I was involved. One of the things we found was a very direct relationship between lack of economic opportunity and therefore violence, organized crime, potential terrorist instincts, and flow of people. And flow of people is quite disruptive everywhere. And so back then, and apologies for interrupting the question, Tim, but the analogy I'm pretty sure is there. We tried to create something called a reconstruction opportunity zone on the western part of Pakistan. And the idea was, hey, anyone who comes and creates a business here can export anything to the U.S. tax-free. And so actually there were some other countries sending entrepreneurs there who weren't even Pakistani companies, they were from all over the place, African companies, whatever. They'd come, they'd set up a plant there, they'd hire locals, they'd give those locals jobs, and the idea would be, hey, let's do this. The ultimate plan never got passed, it was piloted, never actually got done, but the concept is a valid one. What if we allowed, some sort of opportunity zone logic there in the Northern Triangle? Hey, you guys, create jobs here, create economic activity. Let's actually improve the lives and lots of those individuals there. They will feel less compelled, less desperate to go seek opportunity elsewhere. Seems like a pretty simple plan. Let's just create economic opportunity. And I know Mexico's done a reasonable job at that, of creating economic opportunity, but they've become a transit now. They've become the way station on your way through. So, look, I think economic opportunity ultimately is the way forward, which is why a lot of these other countries, Tim, and again, we're going back there, but they're happy to embrace reliable energies because reliable energies power economies. Reliable energies give economic opportunity, increase prosperity, and move people out of, poverty in towards a middle class. Less poverty, less violence.
Yeah. So, in terms of Northern Triangle in particular, would you want to see a creation of economic opportunity zones there? What
Sure.
sort of things do you think might
Yeah,
help?
look, I'll be honest with you, I haven't studied this specific set of regional issues with great depth.
You mean you don't know
Okay.
everything about everything in the
Well,
world?
so I spent time down in Colombia, I spent time in Chile, Peru, a lot of Latin America, I spent time in Mexico, haven't spent that much time in Central America.
We'll get you there.
I would love to, so I don't know the specifics of the economic opportunities that would be there. But if there are opportunities that could be developed, meaning some natural resources that are unique to there, that there would be some comparative or competitive advantage for them to export, being able to let them export it tax-free, giving some incentives to create that production there. Again, I'd have to dig deeper and learn more, but in concept, yes.
Yeah, good. Okay. You brought up Afghanistan previously.
Yep.
It's been about a year since
Yep.
the withdrawal. Can you talk a little bit about your view of what the U.S. should have done, could have done better in that country?
Yeah, that's a tough one. I mean, look, at the end of the day, the withdrawal was really quite destabilizing, quite horrible. Loss of lives, loss of American service members' lives, loss of countless Afghani lives. A bad thing, just a generally bad thing. I would go so far as to say, if you really do believe in where I started, American strength, enemies take notice, they don't pursue hostile ambitions. American weakness, enemies take advantage, they pursue hostile things. You might be able to, and I would consider it a dotted line, but some of the death taking place in Ukraine could also be tagged to this Afghan withdrawal disaster. So I do think it was a big deal. I think it was a really, really pivotal moment that changed the sort of world perception of the United States. And that's disappointing. What do we want to do? We need to prevent Afghanistan from becoming a safe place for terrorism to brew and develop capabilities to be inflicted on U.S. interests anywhere in the world. That's the simple goal. How do we do that? That's a more complicated question. But that should be the goal. I mean, even recently, I think the use of drones or whatever, insofar as they're harboring Al-Qaeda there, they need to make sure that that's not a risk that is ever something that can threaten the way of life of Americans anywhere. And so I'm a big believer that we can monitor and manage some of these risks. We have good technologies. We can keep tabs on it. We need to be careful that it doesn't reemerge as, again, this lost, stateless zone of geography where terrorism can sort of, take root and grow.
Yeah.
So that's the big ambition. I mean, beyond that, obviously, I want human rights. I would love, it's sad to me that women there are not getting educated. I mean, all of the human rights things, which we've talked about in other venues here about the human rights things. I find those all horrifying, and of course, I want all that to be eliminated, all those abuses.
And we're seeing a massive humanitarian crisis in that country in terms of the largest drought they've seen in decades, food insecurity. What role and how can the U.S. work in Afghanistan to help alleviate some of those issues while knowing that the Taliban are in charge?
Yeah, that's a tough one, and here's why. And I'll give you some of my experience from. So I spent a lot of time on the ground in Africa, which you might think is very different, but some of these countries had strong men, they had strong groups running them, and I'm not convinced that any foreign aid helped. And it sounds controversial, but let me tell you why. It emboldened. It's always about who was who was in control of the aid. Countries facing famine. Yes, all of us want to help. You want to give food, bring that compassion to suffering individuals in this planet. When we have capacity, they don't. Let's give them food. And what it ended up doing was strengthening some of these dictators in Africa, because what we saw was they became the pivot point, and now they had the currency of the day and the currency of the time, which was food. And we just gave them a whole bunch. And they say, so now who do we distribute it to? It became a political thing. Are you loyal? You're not loyal. And so I'm always very cautious and nervous is even a better word about handing it to regimes such as the Taliban, because it might embolden and empower them, even domestically, against those that might be more aligned with our interests. And so, insofar, and I realize it's a very complicated thing, there are NGO networks that are, to actually be useful that are not the sort of known, dictator single points of control and power. I'm not in favor of that tyrannical distribution model, right, which is going through the tyrannical leader or the authoritarian leader. If there are NGOs, we can support that way. Fine. I'm all for helping the people.
Yeah.
I just want to make sure we're not emboldening or empowering bad people.
Yeah. Well, hopefully the UN World Food Program can strike some deals that make it an effective distribution.
You don't realize that you're opening a can of worms, so I don't know how much time we have.
Sure.
But the UN
Yeah.
and a lot of these multilateral bodies, I am increasingly concerned that they are effectively useless. And they're effectively useless for one main reason. The Chinese have hijacked them, right? I mean, the reality is the World Health Organization wouldn't go investigate the largest pandemic we've had in 100 years to origin because the Chinese effectively didn't want that. The World Trade Organization is not going to talk about intellectual property theft or state subsidization that's taking place in China because China is really engaged. The UN Human Rights Council is not going to talk about China as having a genocide in Western China because they've got all sorts of Belt and Road allies afill in the UN Human Rights Council. So, I know you didn't mean to go here, I know you didn't mean to open this can of worms, but when you start talking about the UN Food Network, I said, yeah, I hope so.
Sure.
I hope so. I want to believe there's multilateralism that focuses on humanitarian reasons to save and help people who are suffering, that gathers from those who have and helps those in the most vulnerable positions at the most vulnerable times. But I'm skeptical of China's objectives and manipulation in this way. Does the UN Food and Agriculture Organization start giving it out to Belt and Road initiatives first, the food aid? Where's the food aid go, Tim? How does it go? Where do they choose? Who chooses? And my guess is China has implicit influence in some of these decisions, and that's where I get a little nervous.
Sure. But isn't it better to have the U.S. have a voice in those decisions as well?
Sure, no, I'm not advocating we abandon.
Sure.
I'm just saying let's acknowledge what they are.
Yeah.
They're not multilateral anymore.
Yeah.
I mean, the fact that we had how many countries abstain from saying Russia invaded Ukraine, condemning that, like, what?
Yeah. Half the world's population is represented by countries who refuse to condemn the invasion.
Stunning!
Yeah.
Stunning! Right? I mean, there you go.
Yeah.
And that's the problem.
Yeah, and those are the conversations we need to have to understand why, Brazil would say, it's fine. We're not going to worry about it. It's in our economic interest to continue to deal with Russia, so we're not going to, we'll let the big powers have what they want, and the weak powers do what they must.
Yeah, I mean, you've seen that. Even I still find this one really horrifying because I had hoped India, which was a question mark. I really thought India was a question mark, not a certain go to Russia ally. And buying oil from the Russians when they, no, we're not going to sanction them on aerospace parts and stuff like that because the Indian Air Fleet has a lot of Russian military equipment and Russian parts. Like, they need them. So, it's a tough one. But yeah, no, it's a precarious world. The key message here, I would say, is we gotta telegraph strength. The world will be safer if America telegraphs strength. Our enemies will take notice. If we are weak, they take advantage. And it's producing, and by the way, that comes, and it bleeds into all the things we talked about.
Yeah.
Energy policy. U.S. energy independence makes the world safer and better for the environment. Two things. Improving national security and the environment? I don't know any policy that can do that. This one does. So I think there's a lot of possibilities and hope here.
Of course. All right. Well, thank you very much, Vikram, for your time. It's been a fun conversation. And thank you to everyone who's watching here live with us, as well as those who are watching the recording. We really appreciate your interest. We welcome your feedback and comments through the chat function, as well as through our council email, council@wacnh.org. We're really looking forward to continuing these conversations with candidates, as well as looking at the state of democracy around the world through our Global Tipping Points series. So we look forward to seeing you in the future. Thank you so much, and thank you to Vikram.
Great, thank you.
We
appreciate it.
Thanks.
Thanks.
All right. Well, we're going to let it